right, so we're talking about how to critique a book fairly. Do you agree or disagree? We're going through examples. We've seen 2 case studies or examples so far with an article about an ad and the ad itself. Now, of course, because it's this class, our third and final example will be a Hercule Poirot short story, this one, Murder in the Mews. And I've chosen this story out of the many options in the book because I believe it conveys a really powerful message. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that message. I'm saying it conveys a powerful message. And so it's a proper story to critique, to say, do we agree or do we disagree? And that's kind of what you could say is the final stage of the task for your upcoming writing project. Remember, last time with Triangular Roads, I really tried to do kind of a demonstration of the work I'm asking you to do on the first major writing project, the rhetorical analysis. And I said there's 5 steps to this rhetorical analysis. We're going to cover the first 4 today. We're going to save the 5th one for once we've reached the pinnacle of analytical reading in the next lesson. So let's review what those steps are and hone in on the 5th and final one as we go to discuss the story. So you're to pick another story from the collection we haven't read yet, so you have to do a little bit more reading. Continue to flex those reading muscles, those little gray scales. Analyze the relationship between author and audience. Again, this class is about learning how to communicate effectively. The best way to do that is to understand your audience and how to reach them. I argue that Agatha Christie had a better understanding of her audience than probably any other author in the history of the world, and she uses that to make her mysteries not impossible, but very difficult to solve. So focusing on how she demonstrates her understanding of author and audience in one of her stories can help you better understand that relationship when you go to create your own compositions, which is what you'll be doing at the end of the quarter. Consider 2 levels of misdirection: the way she portrays Poirot and the way she portrays the possible suspects. So she's able to divert. One of the main ways Christie achieves this not impossible but difficult level of mystery is by casting our attention away from certain suspects. And then Poirot does the same thing, where he tries to disarm the potential killers by making himself not seem like a threat, even though he's a very formidable threat. And so these are just 2 things you can look at as you try to explain to your reader how Christie so thoroughly understands her audience and uses that to her advantage with her goals of creating a challenging mystery. Also, because we're talking about her effectiveness here as a writer, certainly consider her use of credibility, emotion, timing, and logic, those essential appeals I've mentioned from day one that are crucial to the composition of any text. And then finally, in your thesis, answer the question, does Christie create a fair and compelling mystery? So points 1 through 4 here we've really talked about a lot, all throughout the first 4 lessons. But now that we've reached the pinnacle, now that we know how to criticize a book fairly, we can answer number 5 and say, is this a good mystery or not? Is she successful in her goal? Which again should be your thesis statement. So let's look at that with Murder in the Mews. With Triangular Roads, we looked at those first 4 things. Let's look at the 5th and final one. Do we agree or disagree? Do we criticize? What is our response when we criticize it fairly? With the example of Murder in the Mews. And the term mews just refers to a certain type of apartment building in England that was converted from this other older type of building. So once again, she always has those assumptions about Poirot. And there's maybe the best example in the entire canon here where Monsieur, said Poirot, his manner suddenly very foreign. Believe me, my heart bleeds for you. Such a loss, such agony as you must be enduring. Ah, but I will say no more. How magnificently the English hide their emotions. So he has kind of a stereotype about the English here, which connects to something we discussed in our previous lecture. And it connects to the suspect, right? Because the suspect seems surprisingly unemotional when learning about the death of his fiancée. And so Poirot might be kind of goading him, trying to make a comment. Maybe he's being ironic, but it also means this guy's emotions, or lack thereof rather, might not mean he's the killer, even though he's not showing much emotion at the death of his fiance. But what's interesting is this guy very well could be the killer. And so Poirot has not spoken. His partner here, the police inspector Japp, has been doing all the speaking. So when he interjects and speaks for the first time, his manner suddenly becomes very foreign. Remember that that will make the British think of him as less of a threat. They'll kind of dismiss him because of the stereotypes. She understands her audience and she's using stereotypes. So this is really just review of what we discussed last time, but we're seeing yet another example of it here. Also, there's the assumptions about the suspects or the case. In this instance, has to do with more the circumstances of the murder, although there's some stuff with the suspects too. And at the end of the story, the twist we learn is that not murder disguised as suicide, but suicide made to look like murder, says Chief Inspector Japp, who is one of my favorite characters in all of the Hercule Poirot stories. He shows up many times. That's a really common trope, if you've read the mystery or thriller genre at all, right? Is that oftentimes someone will kill someone and then try to make it look like suicide. Here, the twist we learn at the end of the story is that the lady really did kill herself, but her roommate and friend, seeking vengeance, altered the crime scene when she found it and tried to make the suicide look like murder. So it's a bait and switch. Again, just like in Triangle at Rhodes. Remember, in Triangle at Rhodes, we thought there was one love triangle. If we looked more closely at the clues, we would have seen the love triangle was very different than what we initially thought. And so just like the triangle flips in Triangle at Rhodes, here the murder that's masquerading as suicide is actually suicide masquerading as murder. That's the twist, the flip. Again, what we think at the beginning of the story completely shifts by the end, but it's all very true and believable because of how she constructs the mystery and the clues she plants. But even though there are these clues there, we miss them, and that's that understanding between author and audience. So I already mentioned thinking of the flipping from the Triangle at Rhodes. Rhetoric. To continue and see how this story kind of fills out the different aspects of the things I want you to talk about in writing project one. How does it use rhetoric, or in other words, credibility, emotion, timing, and logic? Credibility is Poirot. In all honesty, in asking you to write on a Hercule Poirot story, I've probably downplayed credibility some, but it's important. He says things like he's the greatest detective in the world, and people really are taken aback and awe when they see him, like, oh, this is Hercule Poirot. And what's interesting is most of the time the villains haven't met him before, and so he has his reputation that precedes him, but then they're kind of disappointed. He's not like this hyper masculine, typical detective. He's this kind of effeminate, dandified, foreign guy who's not physically imposing. His ability is his mind, right? That's his secret weapon, his strength. So he plays with credibility. It'd be a way you could think of credibility. Like, he has a reputation that gives him immense credibility, but he tries to downplay that credibility to throw the suspects or the villains off, which is why he all of a sudden seems more foreign than he is when he, starts speaking to one of the suspects for the first time. How about emotion? This story is charged with emotion. Jane Plenderleith, the woman who altered the crime scene, she wants to seek vengeance for her friend. And when in the final dialogue between her and Poirot, which is the most important part of the story, which is the part you'll probably either agree with or disagree when you render your critique, your judgment, she's appealing to him saying, can't you see it from my position? Can't you see why I did what I did? It's a very emotional appeal. There's not a lot of logic behind it. So that can kind of help teach us some of the things I was saying about emotion earlier. Timing. The suicide took place during the fireworks of the Guy Fawkes celebration, so no one heard the gunshot. This turns out to be a red herring because she's just trying to kill herself. So she didn't necessarily want to cover it up or hide it. But what's interesting is it prevents anyone from discovering her body until her roommate gets home the next day. So it actually creates the opportunity for her roommate to do this because Miss Plenderleith's decision to alter the crime scene is a spur of the moment kind of a thing. Finally, logic. Christie uses logic in our emotions as an audience to divert our attention. Major Eustace seems like the obvious suspect because he is a sleazy bad guy, but he would have no motive for murder since he is the one blackmailing Mrs. Allen. His characterization obscures the obvious clue. Remember, what Agatha Christie does, you've probably learned by now, is present us with the facts, the clues, and then we make some kind of assumption. Most of the time, she's completely flipped our assumption. It's different people in the love triangle, or it's a suicide looking like murder rather than a murder looking like a suicide. But there's always some clue that would help us figure it out. That if we just paid attention to that clue, we'd solve the mystery no problem. The obvious clue here is Major Eustace would have no reason to kill Mrs. Allen. It's like killing the golden goose. He's getting 200 pounds which was a lot of money back then, every couple of months from her. If he kills her, that goes away. Even if she'd refused to pay him, he would have gone to her fiance and followed through on his blackmail scheme. He wouldn't kill her because if he went to her fiance, maybe he could get, more money or something. So he has no motive. You need a motive for murder, right? But this guy is awful. When Poirot and Japp go to talk to him, he is sleazy, and our emotions take over in that moment. We say, I want him to be the killer. I want him to be the bad guy. I want to see him punished, which is what Jane Plenderleith wants. But that defies logic because he has no motive. So here you see how Christie uses logic to have the case. It all makes sense. It makes perfect sense. But our emotions blind us, as we talked about earlier, from seeing the truth. She knows that can happen. That's how she uses emotion, how she misdirects us, how she understands us as the audience. So finally, we've kind of recapped the first two stages of analytical reading there. And recapped what we discussed in the last lecture by giving you like another case study in this lecture. Finally, let's get to what we haven't covered yet. The question of, does she create a fair and compelling mystery? This story, compared to the first three you read, I think it gets at a deeper meaning, a more powerful message than what we saw in the other stories, though they were very enjoyable. So it provides a good example for critique then. So let's go through it with the three stages of analytical reading. Stage one, what is the book about? It's about murder, like all of her stories. What is the message of the book? Here's one of the things Poirot says about murder. Yes, he said, it was murder, the willful destruction of one human being by another human being. So if it's about murder, he's now given us a definition of murder, the main character, the detective. What's interesting about this is he says the willful destruction of one human being by another. This is before he's revealed everything. This is when he just tells Miss Plenderleith that it's murder, not suicide. But what murder is he talking about, and how do you define murder? He defines it as the willful destruction of one human being by another. He doesn't say the willful killing of one human being by another, because killing is a very specific definition, but destruction is a more ambiguous term. There's more than one way to destroy someone. You don't just have to kill them. So he's already redefined murder. So this is already one of the messages of the book, and you can either, agree with it or not. And here's more on that here. Do you wonder why I did what I did? and you stand there calling it murder. So Miss Plunderleath is saying, once she saw the scene of the suicide, she saw an opportunity to frame Major Eustace and seek vengeance on him for how he treated her friend. And she's saying that dressing it up as suicide, that's seeking a vengeance. Poirot's calling it murder. He's calling it the willful destruction of another human being. She wants to destroy Major Eustace, and he's calling her out on that. And so she's saying, why do you call that murder? This is what he says in response. Because it was murder. Poirot's voice was stern. Murder can sometimes seem justified, but it is murder all the same. You are truthful and clear-minded. Face the truth, mademoiselle. Your friend died in the last resort because she had not the courage to live. We may sympathize with her, we may pity her, but the fact remains the act was hers, not another. So, what is Poirot saying here? Well, he's not denying that Major Eustace is a bad guy, and Japp has arrested him on all these other crimes. In the next paragraph, he says he'll spend a lot of time in jail. He's saying that's a punishment. But you're trying to punish him for something he did not do. You're trying to take another's action and ascribe it to him. And he also makes a comment about how her friend sort of gave up. She was in a difficult position. She felt like she couldn't get married because she'd really be, or her husband rather, to be the golden goose then because he's a rich guy. So Major Eustace could just keep blackmailing her and get even more money from her. She had to stop that. Somehow she thinks so. She chooses to kill herself. But Poirot is saying here, no matter the circumstances, suicide's not the right answer. And this man should be punished. He's a bad man. He will be punished. But it is wrong to try to ascribe a crime to him he didn't do. And Miss Plunderleath, you're a good young woman. Willfully destroying another human being is not something that you want to follow through with. And she says no. And she walks out. And even though she's done some things wrong here, they don't arrest her. They let her walk out. So there's another comment. A comment, right, that Major Eustace should be punished, and he is. A comment that Poirot doesn't see suicide as an acceptable alternative. A comment that Miss Plunderleath, they're letting her off the hook, even though he sees what she did as wrong, and that she sees the opportunity to stop seeking vengeance. So there's a lot here to agree or disagree with. If you pick this for your discussion board post, I'm very excited to read your critique. Very excited to read whatever it is you critique, even if it's one of the other options, and really excited to read your papers in a few weeks and see, what you think of a different story you choose to analyze, your critique of a story of your choosing. That I'm really looking forward to reading.